the past few decades, female protagonists have become increasingly more popular, more developed, and more complex in both film and television. While the majority of these characters have been appealing heroines, there's an interesting facet of the female protagonist world that, despite the fact that they are designed to appeal to a female audience, seem to completely fail to do just that. Although there are an unfortunate number of female leads that are incredibly off-putting to real-life girls and women, one of the most interesting cases of this phenomenon is the leading character of the Vampire Diaries, Elena Gilbert. Elena is an intriguing failure of a character for a few reasons. Firstly, what likely makes her an unappealing protagonist in the eyes of TVD's female audience is that instead of being a leading character who is an active participant in the narrative, Elena is actually extremely passive. Shockingly so, considering the fact that she's actually supposed to be the heroine of the series. Secondly, Elena's narrative is largely driven not by what she can accomplish, or how she pushes the overall narrative forward, but by what she can suffer and endure. What makes her heroic is not that she's an actual hero, but the fact that she experiences a seemingly endless amount of pain and still continues to exist. Unfortunately, this is a fairly common female heroine archetype, one that has had ebbs and flows of popularity, but that seems to be finally dying out in favor of female leads who are actually active participants in their own storyline and the larger storylines of their film or series. However, something that makes Elena of particular interest is that this is not Elena Gilbert. I haven't personally read the novel versions of the Vampire Diaries story, but what makes the TV adaptation of Elena so fascinating is that she's radically different from the book version of Elena. While Damon and Stefan underwent a bit of an adaptation makeover as well, they both still embody the same character archetype that they represent in the books. However, the TV version of Elena is basically the polar opposite of the book version. That switch-up is extremely interesting and telling in a lot of ways. Because firstly, it seems to indicate that the writers and creators of the Vampire Diaries didn't think that the characterization of the female lead character in the books was of particular importance. And secondly, that means that the TV creators very intentionally made Elena Gilbert into this character because they believed it would be much more appealing to the teenage girl audience that they were attempting to court. While Elena certainly does have fans and isn't quite universally hated, it's interesting that the other two female characters are so much more popular among fans, despite the fact that the show essentially instructs its audience to love Elena more than any other girl in the Vampire Diaries fictional universe. After all, every character, including the other female characters, treat her like she's the most important person in the world. But upon further examination, it's really not hard to see why. Elena is an almost entirely passive character within the story throughout all 6 of her seasons on the show, which is actually a pretty astounding accomplishment given the circumstances. For the first 2-ish seasons, much of the fascination surrounding Elena is driven by the fact that she looks like Catherine Pierce. Obviously, the doppelganger mythology becomes more relevant later, but it's extremely telling and more than a little hilarious that what's supposed to make Elena so special and interesting to nearly every supernatural creature that's drawn to her is that she literally looks like someone else. Then, once the show actually explains why Elena looks identical to Catherine, Elena is still relegated to a completely passive role in the story, despite the fact that she's supposed to be the central figure in Klaus's sacrifice. Being a doppelganger comes with no exceptional abilities or powers, beyond Elena's inexplicably magical blood that seems to continually serve as a deus ex machina for the rest of her character's tenure on the series. And once again, despite the story being completely driven by Klaus's need to kill Elena to break his hybrid curse, this story is just going on around her for almost its entire duration. And honestly, her role in that story could be played by an inanimate object for the vast majority of its run. Once again in Season 3, after a brief moment where she's trying to rescue Stefan, and seemingly at least taking charge for once, she's relegated back to a tool in Klaus's hybrid siring tool belt. something she has no control over, and that more importantly has nothing to do with her as an individual person, and positions her as more of an object within the narrative rather than a subject. Towards the end of that season, Elena's character finally undergoes a radical transformation that everyone was expecting at some point, but did actually come as a surprise at the time. And she becomes a vampire. But of course, because the series seems to keep Elena as a passive passenger in the story instead of an active participant, even her choice to become a vampire isn't really a choice. After 3 straight seasons of Elena somehow threatening to kill herself in order to save someone else, she does finally actually get the chance to prove her willingness to sacrifice herself for others. But even in this instance, Elena is as passive as possible. She literally just has to sit there and die. And of course, if anyone was hoping that Elena's transition into vampirism would lead to a transition towards a more empowered and influential character in the series, they were bound to be disappointed. Elena spent most of her time as a vampire in season 4 just losing her shit over how ill-equipped she was to be a vampire. And everyone around her started tearing the world apart trying to fix this problem for her. Even on the rare occasions where her ideas drove the story forward, for instance when she suggested that Jeremy kill Cole, she wasn't the person actually doing anything to change things. But in an exceptionally horrifying turn of events, the show took Elena's lack of empowerment and control in her own narrative to its grossest extreme with her sire bond to Damon. Even when Elena falls in love with someone, it's apparently never her choice. Because, in addition to the sire bond with Damon, and despite the fact that her romance with Stefan was portrayed as epic love, it's retconned in season 5 to be nothing more than some weird doppelganger echo of Silas and Amara's epic love. Throughout season 5, Elena finds herself a helpless victim once again. First as a prisoner for the Augustines, and then as the literal physical host for Catherine. Then Elena's doppelganger nature becomes the center of some other weird spell within the Offensive as Hell Traveler storyline. And then for some ungodly-ass reason, she rounds out this season by literally being a passenger in Damon's car while they kill themselves. Somehow, her season 6 storyline is even duller and grosser. She's gone full soap opera heroine with her amnesia thing, and her story is largely driven by her falling in love with Damon again. And then, in the pièce de résistance of treating your female lead character like a thing instead of a person, Elena is written out of the show by being put in a magical coma, somehow managing to make her both an object and a helpless victim within the story, who is somehow being self-sacrificing by literally sitting there and doing nothing for what was supposed to be a lifetime. But Elena's character isn't just a failure because she is essentially a passive cog in the story rather than an active participant. What is supposed to make her truly appealing to the audience is her constant victimhood. It's both interesting and horrifying, because right from the start of the series, what's supposed to make Elena so unique and deep in comparison to everyone else around her is her suffering. She even comes close to outright saying this in the pilot of the series, because she literally explains that she used to be an entirely different person before her parents died. And if this were a one-off situation, it might be easy for the audience to overlook. However, the show has Elena continually suffer on a nearly constant basis going forward. And something that is clearly meant to demonstrate her as special and unique is her ability to endure this endless stream of pain. This should come as no surprise to viewers of the Vampire Diaries, as the show has a very violently misogynistic point of view that seems to heap exceptional suffering onto its female characters. However, what obviously sets Elena apart is the way that the narrative treats her, and the way the audience is supposed to see her. While a character like Caroline is meant to suffer without being sympathetic because she's the annoying, desperate girl who isn't deserving of sympathy, and a character like Bonnie is meant to suffer without being sympathetic because she's not white enough, Elena is just the picture-perfect image of feminine victimhood. Elena's victimhood is meant to make her a heroine because she supposedly embraces it. and because the series embraces the unfortunately common held point of view that what makes a man special is what he does, while what makes a woman special is what she endures. And ironically, Elena's suffering doesn't differ drastically from literally every other character's suffering either. Nearly everyone has had to endure an insane amount of loss. Elena's brother Jeremy endures a nearly identical amount of personal loss. But Elena's pain is supposed to be different because she's different. Granted, she never actually shows the audience why she's different, but still, everyone should know that she's special simply because the other characters never stop talking about how special she is. It's never a good sign when a show has to explain things to its audience in the dialogue. But it's especially funny and cringy when it comes to Elena, because their descriptions of her as a person almost never match up with how she actually behaves as a character. As far as her actual characterization goes, she's all over the place. She's wildly inconsistent, and it's obvious that the way that she behaves in any given circumstance is not about consistent character development, but is solely driven by where the writers want the narrative to go and how Elena needs to act in order to get the story there. But what's also interesting and astoundingly bizarre is that Elena is something that I can only characterize as some sort of a reverse Mary Sue. Plenty of people incorrectly identify her as a Mary Sue because that's exactly how she's described within the dialogue of the show. Just a character who is special in every way imaginable. But the way that she's described never actually matches up to the way that she behaves. Ultimately, it should come as no surprise that despite the fact that Elena Gilbert was supposed to be the leading heroine in a show written for girls and women, she wound up being arguably the most widely disliked character in the entire series. After all, what is there to like? Her characterization is wildly inconsistent. The obsession with her as a not like other girls girl is naturally off-putting to most female audience members. Her position within the narrative almost never gives her any agency. On the rare opportunity that she could have agency within her own story, she almost never takes it. And the audience is supposed to be impressed with her simply because she continues to exist through seemingly endless suffering. If anything, the most surprising aspect of her character is that the writers radically changed the original character into the Elena that we see on screen. A baffling decision that makes it seem like the show managed to succeed in spite of their creation instead of because of it. But what do you think? Did Elena's perpetual helpless victimhood cause her to flop with the broader audience? Or is she even a flop at all? Leave your comments and opinions below. And if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.